Hello, this is Kim Socha. I would like to thank the organizers of the second annual Engaging with Eco-Ability Conference and also those presenting and listening in. It's a pleasure to be sharing my work with you today. I have a short piece entitled What About the Plants? Integrating Ecology into Eco-Ability. As a contributor to the first book on eco-ability, and co-editor of a special issue on eco-ability for the Journal of Critical Animal Studies, I have noticed the difficulty some scholars, not all, appear to have in integrating the environment proper, what I call green nature, into their work. The correlations between human and non-human animals with disabilities seem a more natural fit for some, relegating plants, trees, mountains, oceans, etc. to the margins of the theoretical perspective. Indeed, when co-authoring both the book chapter with Dr. Deanna Adams and the journal introduction with Drs. Joe Leeson-Schatz and Judy Castles-Bentley, we felt a need to both defend and find the right words to align the environment with human and non-human animal issues. For example, in the book chapter, Shocking into Submission, Suppressive Practices and Use of Behavior Modification on Non-Human Animals, People with Disabilities, and the Environment, Deanna Adams and I note the following in the first paragraph. Behavior modification techniques used to train dogs to stop barking, stay, and roll over are the same used in the modification of behavior in students with disabilities. Although these methods may not seem directly applicable to the natural environment, we argue that the same Western colonial mindset of controlling that which deviates from mainstream expectations and desires underpins attempts to dominate nature as well. In the Journal for Critical Animal Studies special issue introduction, Joe, Judy, and I state that although the environment is not generally seen as a marginalized group in the anthropocentric and even non-human-centric sense, considering our current ecological crises, the living world we term nature is certainly a casualty of human dominance and unbridled technological advances. And we further state this caveat in the introduction. With a few negligible exceptions, environmental issues do not factor highly into this special issue. To be sure, we are pleased with the variety of essays amassed for this collection. At the same time, we look forward to developing discussions and scholarship about eco-ability that thoughtfully integrate environmental issues into this growing intersectional area of theory and political action. So that's really what I'm attempting to do with this presentation, is just argue that we need to be more thoughtful and deliberate in our integration of ecology into the area of eco-ability. So I don't have all the answers at this time, but I want to offer some suggestions for how we can do that. To provide an example of human dominance over green nature, I want to share a passage from the chapter Shocking into Submission, because it demonstrates the ways in which the environment's supposed unruliness results in human attempts to keep it at bay. After discussing the mechanisms used to control children with disabilities and domesticated animals, for example, shock collars, are used in both cases, Deanna and I argue that, aside from the obvious environmental devastation that humanity now faces, there are more subtle ways that the natural environment is also shocked into submission. However, because supposed non-sentient life does not react with sound or movement that humans can perceive, the correlations between sentient and non-sentient existence are often ignored. However, industrialized society controls nature in other ways by attempting to integrate it into its environs constructed of steel, glass, and concrete, which I admit come from nature as well. Everything does, but I'm not yet prepared to address that paradox, at least not in this presentation. Thus, we have green spaces in urban and metropolitan areas, and expertly constructed landscapes within suburban developments, golf courses, resorts, and college campuses. But rather than incorporating green nature into our mechanized culture, I see such constructs as an example of what I term symbolic nature. indicating images of an untouched wilderness ironically crafted by human hands as works of art, as opposed to living ecosystems. In sum, although shocking living beings into submission may seem relegated to animals and non-humans, this happens with green nature too. For example, these green spaces constructed in urban and metropolitan environments. Another example are the weed killers humans use to prevent nature from springing up through cracks in our sidewalks, along with pesticides that are sprayed on plants to prevent other organisms from eating human food sources. So these would be two issues that I think eco-ability should be willing to engage with. I admit, for an animal activist such as myself, it is much harder to feel sympathy and passion for non-animal beings, and perhaps that is why it is more difficult to integrate environmental concerns into theories of eco-ability with the same fervor one does for non-human animals and human beings with disabilities. In one way, the reason is quite simple. The environment is not sentient, although it teems with sentient life, and thus cannot suffer physical pain and psychological torment. This brings me to the second part of my talk, one that should be of growing interest to animal and environmental activists: the question of sentience among organisms not of the Animalia kingdom. Most activists have heard tongue-in-cheek questions about plant sentience within their animal advocacy. But while it is tempting to dismiss this red herring question out of hand, I believe we need to give it more serious thought and develop more sophisticated responses to the query, although it is most often asked with flippant indifference to those who are hostile to veganism. Within those responses we may craft, however, are avenues for integrating the seemingly non-sentient environment into a holistic eco-ability theory that benefits both animals and the planet. I should begin by stating I am not of the mind that plants feel pain. However, I absolutely believe they are alive, of course, respond to stimuli, and have a desire to flourish, amongst other amazing abilities best left to a botanist to explain. Plus, I am open to exploring any trustworthy material to prove my conclusions on plant sentience incorrect. However, none currently exist. During my vegan outreach, I invariably come across the plant sentience question, and it is almost always asked by one who thinks he or she is hysterically funny or has found a fissure in vegan ethics. In other words, they don't really care about plant sentience. They just want to poke fun at and cause the vegan to not have answers to their queries. But I, as do others in this position, usually respond with the answers that plants have no central nervous system or fight or flight response mechanism that most pain-feeling organisms have. Indeed, pain and terror, when looked at from a certain perspective, are actually gifts allowing one to flee predators. As such, it would be a nasty trick of evolution to develop a group of about 300,000 living species, or plant species, who are subject to the same emotional and physical pain that, for instance, a primate undergoes on the vivisector's table without any ability to flee their environments or empirically respond that they do not want to be so treated. I usually respond to the diversionary plant question by saying, if you are worried about eating plants because they possibly feel pain, then stop eating meat because animals irrefutably feel pain. Further, meat eaters are responsible for exponentially more plant deaths in their lifetimes because the amount of plant foods so-called food animals eat before slaughter and ingestion by humans. That response is usually enough to shut someone up, but as activists, we should aim higher than shutting down arguments. Rather, we should be able to engage in real discussions about the ecological world as an entity worthy of our attention and compassion. Recently, a study was published reporting that plants can hear themselves being eaten. Both this report and others of its kind are usually simplified and result in news articles that take such findings and come up with titles such as, the most recent one I saw is, Nice try, vegans. Plants can actually hear themselves being eaten. One such article begins with the admonishment, "Vegetarians, get off your high horses." It is tempting to dismiss such responses as guilty omnivores blowing off steam or standard attacks by those who assume vegans and vegetarians are ethically self-righteous, and admittedly some are, but I don't believe that to be the case for each and every vegan. However, I argue that we need to develop a more deliberate ethical model surrounding plant life, to learn about the lives of plants, to not laugh at or shy away from studies of this kind that arise, none of which argue for or try to prove plant sentience, I should note. Because plants absolutely do have a desire to flourish, but that doesn't necessarily indicate ability to feel emotional or physical distress. As proponents of eco-ability, it behooves us to understand and respect non-animal life as a living embodiment that does not have to be anthropomorphized to be of relevance. Perhaps then we will find environmental concerns easier to integrate into holistic theory and practice of eco-ability. Thank you. In closing, I do want to ask a few questions that arose for me when considering the content of my presentation, and questions that I hope others will think about, although they certainly do not have to be answered during the course of this conference. The first is really what my presentation was premised on, which is what is the cause of that disconnect between humans and with disabilities, non-human animals, and then the ecology. Why, when I was editing that special issue of the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, did nature receive such scant attention? So I think I offered some ideas as to why that is, but I certainly don't have all of that figured out. The other question I want us to consider is, well, it's based on the idea that likely most people accept. Anything that deviates from the norm in contemporary Western society is often posed as inferior. And I think that applies to nature as well. And it kind of reinforces that binary of theory the binary of nature versus culture, as if the two aren't interrelated. Now, this is a binary that springs from Continental Rationalist philosophy, which really looked at nature as something that's fascinating, but also to be feared and controlled. And to anthropomorphize this issue for a moment, when you think about Europeans coming to what they termed the New World, to what we currently term North America, and looking at native peoples in much the same way as nature is looked at, as inferior but also fascinating, something to be feared and also something to be controlled. I think this somewhat applies to the previous question I asked, which is how can we break down that binary? In which ways can we integrate those beings from the Animalia kingdom into nature, including trees, mountains, oceans, etc. And then the final question is something I also touched on in my presentation, which is how far do we go as those who are interested in eco-ability as a theory or practice? How far do we go into integrating the realities of the natural world, such as plants, trees, mountains, and oceans? And I ask this because even those I know who are vegan and who do care about the environment, perhaps secondary to veganism, who are often very willing to dismiss the plant question or roll their eyes and explain that, it's always that red herring question. But I think we owe it a little bit more consideration, obviously, but also with other studies that are coming out, whether they have scientific backing or not, I'm not sure. But for example, the idea that water itself is alive, that water responds to different outside stimuli, as do plants, which we're really willing to give a little bit more consideration than we probably would a body of water. Do we acknowledge such ideas? What place do they have in the field of eco-ability? So I guess the question is, do we ourselves as eco-ability theorists owe it to the idea to understand more about the natural world, to go beyond our presumptions of what it is capable and not capable of doing? Thank you again.